Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is researching the paranormal. My guest, Colm Kelleher, is a biochemist with an extensive background in cell and molecular biology. He has served as vice president and chief scientist for environmental control and life support systems at Bigelow Aerospace. Additionally, he has managed the day-to-day operations of the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Applications Program of the U.S. government through a contract given to the Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies Organization, of which he was deputy administrator. He has served as deputy administrator for the National Institute for Discovery Science, and currently he plays a similar role at the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies. He is author of Brain Trust, the hidden connection between mad cow and misdiagnosed Alzheimer's disease. He is co-author with George Knapp of Hunt for the Skinwalker, Science Confronts the Unexplained at a Remote Ranch in Utah, and he is also co-author with George Knapp and James T. Lakatsky of Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, an insider's account of the secret government UFO program. Colm lives in the Las Vegas area, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Colm. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Jeff. I've seen your show so many times, and it really is a privilege to be on your show.
Well, it's a privilege for me to be able to interview you with your extensive background in trying to apply hardcore scientific methods to some of the most difficult problems that are known to exist in any of the paranormal sciences. I thought a good place to begin would be back in, I guess it would be about 1994, 95, 96, when you first applied to be a part of the National Institute of Discovery Science.
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty good place to start. At the time, I was working in a mainstream immunology research institute in Denver, Colorado, called the National Jewish Center for Immunology. I was doing what could be loosely called mainstream research on molecular immunology. My background is biochemistry. And I saw this really bizarre advertisement in Science magazine, which is one of the premier science publications in the world. And the ad said, "We are looking for scientists to research the origin and nature of consciousness in the universe." And of course, this was in the middle of a lot of advertisements for postdoctoral fellows in immunology, for biotechnology positions. And here we have, in the middle of nowhere, it was half a page ad, so it was a pretty expensive ad that talked about the origin and evolution of human consciousness in the universe. So I was sufficiently intrigued that I picked up the telephone and I called the number. And eventually I got onto Robert Bigelow. So he invited me out to Las Vegas for an interview for this new organization he was calling the National Institute for Discovery Science. This was in July of 1996, which is, 25 years ago now, at least 25 years ago. So I hopped on a plane and ended up at his corporate headquarters, had a face-to-face interview with Robert Bigelow. He was asking mostly questions about how science could be applied to anomalies research. And he was asking about crop circles. He was asking about cattle mutilations. And he was asking about, mainstream UFO type research. And so I answered all the questions, and he hired me, and started work there very, very quickly. And one of the first assignments I had for NIDS was to go over to England and start checking out some of these amazing crop circles that were happening in the fields in southern England. So I spent about a week there, gathered a whole bunch of samples from some formations, brought them back, and started the whole process of getting into analysis of crop circle, essentially molecular biology, to see if there were any changes in the DNA or the protein of these plants. But almost immediately after I got back, Robert Bigelow announced that he was on the way to purchasing a ranch up in northeastern Utah, because there was a lot of newspaper articles and all of that suggesting that this was a paranormal hotspot that included UFO activity. So, long story short, Robert Bigelow purchased the ranch in August 1996. Myself and another physicist and a veterinarian were deployed very quickly on Skinwalker Ranch within actually a few weeks of the purchase, and we started a whole sort of menu of research that initiated not only deploying sensors on the property, but also deploying people. So the idea was to have a living laboratory on Skinwalker Ranch that we could assess what was going on, because a lot of the stories had reported on everything from nuts and bolts, saucer-like objects that had been seen around the property, as well as cattle mutilations, and also unusual creatures, discarnate voices, poltergeist activity. So it was a paranormal Disneyland that really started the whole thing off.
All of this occurred, I gather, just within a few months of your joining the organization.
That's right. It was a baptism of fire, because I had been in mainstream science pretty well for 20 years at that stage. And as I said, it was I was used to applying the scientific method through a laboratory, but not a paranormal laboratory, and certainly not a laboratory that was located out on the wilds of northeastern Utah. So it was quite a baptism of fire, because the previous rancher had he had a herd of cattle, very high-end Simmental and Angus cattle that had been deployed on the property, and he had essentially gone out of business. He had lost something like 15 separate animals, high-end animals, to either mutilation, cattle mutilation, or plain old disappearance. And so he had pretty well lost his livelihood. So he sold the property to Robert Bigelow. He was retained as ranch manager for probably about a year after the sale. But within, like I said, a couple of weeks, we were doing 5-day and 10-day tours on Skinwalker Ranch. So for the next couple of years, I spent literally 300 plus days on Skinwalker Ranch, and we had several scientists. We had a lot of sensor equipment that was optical, as well as electromagnetic, magnetic field sensors. We even had radiation sensors, just in case any of these rumors that were floating around the UFO arena might come true. So we actually had radiation sensors on the property. They actually never detected anything, but it was part of the menu of sensor equipment that we deployed on the property. And very soon after deploying on the property, I had my first sort of face-to-face, in-your-face activity on the property. I was standing outside the main command and control center, and this object came right over my head. It came over Skinwalker Ridge, which is on the north end of the property. It was low flying really quickly, and it was completely silent. So it was moving at about the same acceleration as an F-18 jet, but it did a perfect U-turn above my head, and there was another scientist standing right beside me, and then it just exited straight over Skinwalker Ridge, exactly on the path that it had arrived. And it was gone within less than 30 seconds. But this was my first introduction to something that was unusual. It was low enough in the sky that I could actually see some kind of structure behind it. It was a light, but it was very, very silent. It was almost spooky in how silent it was, but it moved very quickly, and the turn it made was pretty well impossible for an F-18 to make, because it was a really tight hairpin turn. And that was my basic introduction to life on Skinwalker Ranch.
I wonder about the name Skinwalker. How did that designation come to apply to this property?
The ranch itself was embedded in a Native American reservation. It was a Ute reservation. So very shortly after we arrived on the property, we got talking with who used to be the ranch manager and now was working for us, a guy called Terry Sherman, and he said that in his conversation with the Ute tribe, that the Skinwalker Ranch, or the ranch itself, was a no-go area for Utes, absolutely a no-go area, and that the reason for that was because the Skinwalker Ridge lay on the path of the Skinwalker, the so-called path of the Skinwalker, and that was this mythical shape-shifting creature that used to apparently walk along the ridge of the ranch at undetermined times. But because of that, the ranch was considered cursed, and also because of that, no member of the Ute Native American tribe would ever set foot on the property. I mean, that was kind of what we were told immediately after gaining access to the ranch.
And as I recall from the first book that you co-authored with George Knapp about the property, I think it was published in about 2005, Skinwalkers also refer to a type of witch or dark sorcerer amongst the native peoples.
That's right. And the reason that the ranch was cursed was because of this black magic activity that had allegedly generated these skinwalkers that were walking along this trail on the ridge in the property. So it was a Native American legend that was also prevalent with the Navajo tribe. But the Utes took it very, very seriously. And if you ever engaged a tribal member in conversation regarding the Skinwalker, the conversation was shut down immediately. Nobody wanted to talk about this stuff at all. So when the Skinwalker Ranch eventually became public, it was against a backdrop of complete silence. It was almost like an omerta within the Ute tribe never to discuss these topics.
And I'm under the impression part of that might be never to discuss it with outsiders who weren't part of the tribe, that this was considered only for tribal members, this knowledge.
That's probably correct. And we were definitely at the very outset of setting foot on Skinwalker Ranch. We were treated with a lot of suspicion. People were beginning to read the newspaper articles all about the sort of the weird stuff that was happening on the property. All of what the Sherman family had gone through was widely publicized, both on radio and in the newspapers. So the locals were very, very reluctant to come forward. But that changed over time. We got we got more and more friendly with the local people, with our neighbors. We started interviewing neighbors around the property. And, it became obvious within a year or two of being on the ranch that all the strange activity that happened on Skinwalker Ranch was certainly not confined to the ranch. All of the neighbors were reporting very similar activity. So we went through a process over many years of interviewing those people pretty exhaustively over the next 2 or 3 years.
And to give our viewers an overview, because it's now been, as you point out, well over 2 decades since this research began, and you co-authored the first book about the property with George Knapp that was published in 2005. As a result of that publication, the military got interested.
Yeah, that was a really interesting sort of turn of events, because the reason that George and I published the book Hunt for the Skinwalker was to see if there was other properties around the country and around the world that were so-called UFO hotspots or paranormal hotspots. And the end result of getting feedback from that first book was that indeed there was a lot of different hotspots around both North America, also Europe and Russia in some cases. But as you mentioned, one of the outcomes of publishing Hunt for the Skinwalker was that we had a guy called James T. Lekatsky, who was a Defense Intelligence Agency analyst, worked at DIA. He had a background in ballistic missile physics, very sort of accomplished guy who had worked as a contractor for the Missile Defense Agency and for over a dozen years with the Defense Intelligence Agency. Well, he read a copy of Hunt for the Skinwalker in early 2007, about 2 years after it was published. One of his co-workers was a guy named Axelrod. We call him Axelrod in the book, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. It's not his real name, but he was also at the time a co-worker of Lekatsky. And so Lekatsky read the book, gave it to his friend Axelrod. Axelrod was just about to be deployed to Iraq on one of many missions to Iraq. So he ended up sitting in the green zone in Baghdad, sitting around the pool, reading the Hunt for the Skinwalker. And he told me much later that the Hunt for the Skinwalker actually became a very popular book among people who were kicking back around the pool in the green zone in Baghdad. So, the bottom line for Lekatsky and Axelrod reading Hunt for the Skinwalker was that Lekatsky started thinking about the security implications of strange objects that were in the United States airspace and were flying without apparent any knowledge or know-how from the United States government. And they were flying over airspace in Utah, and it was seemingly without any feedback whatsoever. So Lekatsky wrote a letter to Robert Bigelow, who at the time was CEO of Bigelow Aerospace, and it was on Defense Intelligence Agency letterhead. And in the letter that Lekatsky wrote, he said that he was interested in exploring the national security applications and the security applications of what was going on at Skinwalker Ranch. Robert Bigelow then invited Lekatsky onto the property, and sort of within a couple of months of the letter, in July of 2007, Jim Lekatsky arrived on the property with Robert Bigelow. And, he only stayed on the property a couple of hours because he was due back in Washington, D.C. the following day. So this was a really fast trip just to show him the property, essentially. But within 45 minutes of being on Skinwalker Ranch, they went into the ranch manager's homestead, which is a small house on the east side of Skinwalker Ranch. And Robert Bigelow was talking with the ranch manager, and Lukatsky was sort of standing there idly. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, behind where Robert Bigelow and the ranch manager were talking, this strange object suddenly, it was like a device, a mechanical looking device, materialized in the kitchen right behind where the two of them were conversing. They couldn't see it. Lukatsky was looking beyond them and saw this tubular, metallic looking device that appeared in sort of yellowish mist or smoke right behind where these two guys were conversing. Lukatsky was kind of dumbfounded. He didn't know what to make of it, so he looked away, thinking, maybe it was, he was seeing things. He looked back, the device was still there. He actually drew a picture of it shortly after he left the ranch, and the description that he put out to us afterwards was that it was the closest approximation was on the cover of Mike Oldfield's 1980s album Tubular Bells, which it looks like a metallic curved type object. Well, that's an approximation of what Lukatsky saw, but it kind of blew him away because he was only on the property for 2 hours, and he was almost sort of targeted, quote unquote, by an appearance of this object, this device that only he was privy to, and it disappeared after about 30 seconds or less, disappeared into thin air, kind of dematerialized, so to speak. And so Lukatsky didn't say anything. He's a pretty reticent guy. He's not he's not prone to sort of, verbalizing everything. So he didn't say anything. And on the way back, on the trip, he was thinking about this, and he really realized that this property had something unusual about it. So he was galvanized to talk to his colleagues at the Defense Intelligence Agency when he got back to Washington, D.C. He reconnected with Robert Bigelow. Robert Bigelow connected with Senator Harry Reid, and Senator Harry Reid connected with Senator Daniel Inouye and Ted Stevens. So within less than a year, I would guess, a bipartisan appropriations was authorized for a $22 million program over a 2-year span that would be focused on, the name of the program was called OSAP. It was Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Application Program. And so the name of that program was OSAP. It was put out for bid on the standard Fed BizOps, what used to be Fed BizOps, and now is called SAM.gov, but it's where DOD, DOE, NASA, pretty well all of the government contractors put out bids and solicitations for contracts. So the DIA contract was nothing different. So it was actually a competitive process where several aerospace entities contacted Lukatsky and DIA. It was a competitive process. Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, which was an organization that Robert Bigelow put together in order to execute this OSAP program, came together really quickly. So Defense Intelligence Agency rejected some of what was put out in that proposal by BAS, but they accepted several key proposals. And within, by September 2008, a contract was initiated, and this program, this Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Application Program, was born. But the whole thing initiated, that chain of events initiated through Lukatsky and Axelrod in 2007, reading a copy of Hunt for the Skinwalker. I mean, obviously, we had no idea that this chain of events could unfold, but it was a very spectacular, series of improbable happenings that came from that book.
At the same time that you began working for the National Institute of Discovery Science, Bigelow established the aerospace company, and I gather you also had a role in that business.
Yes, I did, and that was after the demise of the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Application Program, which terminated in 2010. In 2000, I think it was, Robert Bigelow formed the Bigelow Aerospace, which was an aerospace company that was devoted to deploying expandable spacecraft into low Earth orbit. And the reason for expandable was that it was kind of like a revolution in technology, in that you would launch a complete spacecraft that was compressed into a very small volume. And then once it was launched in low Earth orbit, it would expand to 3 or 4 times its volume. So you got an enormous multiplier in terms of volume, which is very critical for a space station in orbit. So Robert Bigelow had formed that company back in 2000. At the end of the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Application Program, he tapped into my background in chemistry to start solving some problems regarding one of the carbon dioxide removal technologies that Bigelow Aerospace was developing in order to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So I got involved with the essentially troubleshooting the chemistry of these, the technology involved in removing carbon dioxide. And I got more and more involved into that Bigelow Aerospace program from 2010, actually 2011 really, until about 2020. So I became manager of the entire environmental control and life support systems group at Bigelow Aerospace. And our task essentially was to design, develop, test, and ultimately deploy all of the different technologies that went into making 4 to 6 astronauts comfortable in low Earth orbit. So the Bigelow Aerospace modules were conceived as a sort of a next generation version of the International Space Station, which has it has a pretty defined shelf life, which will probably end in about 2030. So the idea was to deploy this commercial space station in low Earth orbit as a sort of a follow-on to the International Space Station. So that was a very interesting program that I was involved in for like 8-9 years.
It is true that at this moment, one of the Bigelow modules is attached to the International Space Station, isn't it?
Yeah, that's another sort of, it was a proof of concept technology demonstrator that was launched in 2016. It was a small Pathfinder technology that was actually human rated by NASA. It was a NASA program. They contracted Bigelow Aerospace to design and develop this small technology demonstrator, 16 cubic meters. It was launched on a SpaceX in the Bay of a Dragon capsule, and it was berthed onto the International Space Station in 2016. It deployed beautifully. In other words, it expanded. The technology for expansion worked beautifully. And all of the sensor data in the last 5 years, since 2016, has been that it has not leaked at all. So it has been a really, NASA has decided that expandable technology for the decade 2021 through 2030 is really what needs to be focused on. And you can already see a lot of the aerospace companies, the large aerospace companies that have been involved in design of space stations and substations, are already getting very interested in expandable technology. So Bigelow Aerospace, with the deployment of this beam, that small 16 cubic meter beam technology has really paved the way for what is probably going to be the complete dominance of expandable technologies, both in low Earth orbit and also the lunar programs.
Back to the work you were doing with the, would I pronounce it, OSAP?
Yes, OSAP.
The OSAP program, I understand, is also often confused now in the popular mind with a different program called ATIP.
Yes, and that arose actually in December of 2017 when the New York Times broke an article on this program, but they got the name wrong, and they also conflated the leadership of the program with another much smaller internal Pentagon program called ATIP that had been looking exclusively at the military interactions with UFOs. And so one of the reasons that Jim Lukatsky and myself decided to write this book, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, was to correct the record, because the New York Times article and all of the media attention subsequent to the New York Times article was all focused on a tiny, tiny part of what OSAP was really doing. And so the purpose of the book was really to set the record straight and to show that the scope of the OSAP program was gigantic compared to the small sliver of information that was reported via the New York Times. I mean, I think the book really encapsulates about 97% of OSAP, what the scope was, whereas the 3% was what the New York Times article had described.
Well, the 3% was quite interesting. It involved tracking unidentified flying objects on radar and visual sighting, video sighting off the coast of California and the Pacific Ocean. It seemed as if what resulted from that was really the first time that I'm aware of that the U.S. government publicly acknowledged the existence of these vehicles that seem to have capabilities far beyond anything that any nation on Earth has yet to produce.
Yes, that is true, even though it took them quite a while to publicly acknowledge this. And the full public acknowledgement came on June 25th, 2021, when they published this report, among those being the case that you cited. But they publicly acknowledged for the first time in history that UFOs are real, and that they may constitute an air safety threat, and they also may even constitute a threat to national security. But that original program regarding the Nimitz carrier strike group that happened in 2004, that investigation was actually an OSAP investigation. It was originally, I was tasked in 2008 when I joined this OSAP program at the invitation of Robert Bigelow to hire a staff that would essentially move into and develop the complete OSAP program. So my task was to hire program managers and military intelligence professionals, scientists and engineers, data analysts, database administrators, security officers, medical people with medical expertise. So I went through a process where I interviewed by telephone and by face-to-face interview about 300 people in about 4.5 to 5 months. I mean, it was a very frantic pace of hiring. We were really trying to recruit the best people we could in the shortest period of time. But one of the first hires that I made was a program manager who was an ex-Marine lieutenant colonel who happened to be an F-18 pilot involved in that Tic Tac case And I had already hired him within 15 minutes of meeting him. He had a great program manager background. His resume was impeccable. So at the very end of the interview, he dropped this bombshell on me that he had been involved in this really bizarre event involving the Nimitz carrier strike group off the coast of San Diego. They were just about to deploy to the Persian Gulf, and about a week or two before they deployed, they started the radar systems on the USS Princeton, which was one of the parts of the carrier strike group, started detecting these objects coming in on ballistic missile trajectories from 80,000 feet and then dropping all the way down to sea level at incredible speeds. So Princeton had logged these events for 3 days before they decided finally to target some F-18s to intercept them to see what they were. So this lieutenant colonel was one of the F-18s that had been deployed to intercept these objects. So long story short, one of the F-18 pilots of the squadron that was launched to intercept actually went down to almost sea level to interact with this object, which was white. It had no aerodynamic surfaces. It had no visible means of propulsion. They described it as being about a 46 feet long, looked like a Tic Tac breath mint, shiny white surfaces, absolutely nothing to indicate how it moved or how it defied gravity. But this F-18 pilot went down to engage it, and he could see that it stopped its movement when the F-18 started getting close to it, and it actually oriented its axis in the direction of the descending F-18 as if it was tracking it. And so you could see the F-18 moving around in a circle of about a mile diameter, and the Tic Tac was moving around opposite in that same circle. And then without warning, the Tic Tac jumped from, close to sea level to about 20,000 feet. And then within another second, it had jumped another 40 miles to a rendezvous point that all of the F-18 pilots knew about and the Princeton knew about, but nobody else knew about. But somehow this Tic Tac knew about this prearranged spot called the cap point, where all of these F-18 pilots knew. So this impossible series of maneuvers was visually seen by F-18 pilots, but also very well documented by the radar systems, these were the advanced state-of-the-art radar systems on the USS Princeton. So, long story short, this program manager who I was interviewing at OSAP told me about this amazing series of events. First thing I did was I called up Robert Bigelow, told him, and together we contacted Lakatsky in Washington, D.C., and this was, I believe, in December of 2008. So Lakatsky contacted Axelrod, who was one of the main people featured in the book Skinwalkers of the Pentagon, and he launched a pretty aggressive investigation during early and mid 2009. Interviewed all of the pilots, interviewed all of the crew people on the Princeton, interviewed a lot of different people, and compiled a report, submitted it to the Defense Intelligence Agency by mid 2009. So that report was an OSAP report. So the entire investigation that had occurred was an OSAP investigation. And, when the New York Times broke the article, that was 8 years later in December of 2017, they tacked on that this had been an ATIP program, but it was actually an OSAP program. But, it was the beginning of this whole new era starting in 2017, where UAPs and UFOs became a lot less controversial. The Tic Tac case became one of the central cases that began convincing the Senate Intelligence Committees, Senate the different Senate committees that were involved in national security, convincing them that the UFO concept was actually a real series of events. And subsequent to the Carrier Strike Group, the Nimitz Carrier Strike Group event, there were dozens, if not hundreds, of separate interactions between various destroyers and F-18s off both the east and west coast of the United States, all of which were gathered into this report that was put out to the public in June 25th of 2021, which I see as being a watershed. It was the day that the United States stopped denying the reality of the UFO phenomenon. It really was a watershed day.
Now, I understand that this particular OSAP report is one of maybe about 100 OSAP reports that were sent to the Defense Intelligence Agency in the first year of the OSAP program.
Yeah, I think it was 104 reports that we eventually submitted, and these reports, they're all summarized line by line in Appendix 1 of our book, but they delineate the scope of the OSAP program. The Tic Tac, as you mentioned, was one of those reports that was submitted. But we had by May of 2009, we had a team of 50 people that had been recruited. We had PhD level scientists, we had engineers, we had technicians. We had started accumulating a very large database. We had security officers, we had people deployed on Skinwalker Ranch. So we were sort of rocking and rolling by summer of 2009, and we had we were investigating everything from the kinds of Tic Tac cases that I've just talked about, but we were also investigating UFO paranormal cases. Like we investigated a family in Indiana, rural Indiana. We deployed people on the spot where they had seen UFOs, and then suddenly poltergeist activity was erupting around their house. So we sent a team to investigate that. We accumulated a report on that. We investigated several medical injury cases that were very sort of in-your-face interactions with UFOs. We had a couple of MD PhDs on our staff that were tasked with investigating these, and we followed these witnesses for months and in some cases years after the initial event. And so we think the OSAP program really pioneered the whole way of long-term follow-up of these cases over time, where we could document the health, or actually the ill health, of some of these people that had close encounters with UFOs, taking serial blood samples, taking serial MRI scans, and we were able to put together pictures that were pretty comprehensive of the effects of the UFO close encounter. And so we think that was a way of pioneering what a future UFO program might look like if it ever comes to pass again in the United States government. But those 104 reports that were submitted to the Defense Intelligence Agency were really thousands of pages. I tell people sometimes that in my office at the BAS headquarters in Las Vegas, we submitted electronic copies of all of these reports, but also paper copies. And I had a set of three-ring binders in my office that was about over 6 feet tall of all of the reports, the 104 reports that we had submitted to the Defense Intelligence Agency. And as I said, they spanned a very, very broad spectrum, everything from paranormal effects, psychological effects, um, you know, to every type of human effect, all the way out to advanced technology analysis, so engineering and physics.
And you were the deputy director of the program responsible for the day-to-day operations.
Yes, that was my role. I was the first hire. Robert Bigelow called me up one day and essentially, talked to me on the telephone. I flew out to Las Vegas, and I was hired as the first person on the OSAP program. So my task was to recruit the entire group, but I was responsible for day-to-day operations of the OSAP program.
You mentioned earlier, I believe, that the budget allocated was $22 million over 2 years. I seem to recall, though, that the program was really ultimately only funded for the first year, or am I mistaken?
No, it was the program was funded for $10 million in the first year and then $12 million in the second year. But towards the end of the second year, there was a lot of political stuff happening. Also, the profile of the program had been raised dramatically within the Pentagon. And there was a lot of unease in the Pentagon about the possibility that this program might end up on the front page of the New York Times, which ironically 8 years later is exactly what happened. And so the original concept of the OSAP program was for a 5-year program. So, we had 50 people that were working full time on, probably 8 or 9 separate projects that were running in parallel. So when the program terminated in September of 2010, all those 50 people essentially had to be disbanded. It was a real pity because, this was, it took a lot of effort to get a full staff that was working full time on this program up, trained and deployed and gathering data in a very short period of time. And it was like a well-oiled machine was starting to really rock and roll when the program was terminated. I believe that if a successful UFO program ever gets going again, I think that the OSAP template, that 2-year program, is the perfect template for a future UFO program, because I think the scope of OSAP was very, very unique, and I believe it needs to be repeated.
And one of the premises of OSAP, as I understand it, was to have a very wide scope that would include both the physical measurements, the nuts and bolts, but also the paranormal component.
That's right. And that is probably, you've just put your finger on probably what was most unique about this program, because right after the contract had been awarded by the Defense Intelligence Agency, the team at Defense Intelligence Agency that was working with James Lukatsky, and also the team with Robert Bigelow that included people like Jacques Vallée and Hal Puthoff and John Schuessler, Robert Bigelow himself. I was involved in some of those initial discussions. So it was really sort of intended to be as broad a scope as possible. And, the idea was to stand on the shoulders of 75 years of UFO research and try to look deeply into not only the sensor-driven aspect of, UFO performance, everything from, theoretical physics, advanced physics, and then leading into engineering. All of that, was well known, but it was absolutely determined by people like Jacques Vallée and Hal Puthoff, John Schuessler, Robert Bigelow, that the scope of this would also include human effects. And, what was really unique was that the team that Dr. Lukatsky had in Washington, D.C., that included Axelrod, It included a woman called Juliette Witt that is also in the book, and several of their colleagues that were it was an interagency grouping out there in Washington, D.C. They were very open-minded, and they accepted the premise that the only real way of addressing the UFO mystery was to create as large a scope as possible. So baked into the actual program was the design and creation of a new database that would be used to gather and collate all of the data. And so even within that database architecture, it was called a data warehouse because the idea was it would have multiple separate databases within the data warehouse. But the layering of that database was specifically structured to address all of human effects, but also all of the physical effects or the physical attributes of UFOs. But the human effects, all of the physiological effects were part of the database. All of the medical injury cases, pathology effects, psychology effects, and then all the way out to paranormal effects. So the database was already baked in terms of its ability to incorporate all of those different aspects of the UFO effects on human. And the open-mindedness by the Defense Intelligence Agency group, in my opinion, was the unique aspect of this. People like Jacques Vallée had been preaching this for decades. Hal Puthoff, John Schuessler, Robert Bigelow, all of that experience went into designing this. But to me, what made this possible was the open-mindedness and the willingness of the Defense Intelligence Agency group to follow the data, not to cut the data off just at a small sliver of UFO performance. And I really think that was a unique part of the Defense Intelligence. It was their openness to incorporating all of this stuff. That human effects are very messy. They tend to be difficult to repeat. There's a lot of biological uncertainty inherent in the data, but the Defense Intelligence Agency people were more than willing to accept that level of uncertainty. And I think that really says a lot to their credit.
One of the unique findings of the OSAP program, I understand, one that I haven't really seen much of it, if anything, in the literature, is that exposure to these paranormal events, whether it's a paranormal creature or a UFO sighting, or well, there are many different ways of describing them, but people seem to then be triggered. I think the word that you used was hitchhikers, that it was as if an entity was following these people around after they had been exposed one time.
Yeah, that was a really remarkable part of what was discovered on during the OSAP program. We during the NIDS times on Skinwalker Ranch, we had got hints. Sometimes, I spent over 300 days on the property, and occasionally my wife would sort of wake up and there'd be people walking towards the bed in the bedroom. There was other times when sort of we'd hear noises in the house and this kind of thing. But it was same thing with Robert Bigelow. He and his family experienced stuff during those early days, but it was very low level, and it was taken as sort of not something that we got alarmed about. When the Defense Intelligence Agency took over the investigation on Skinwalker Ranch, one of the first thing they did was they sent groups of people out there, essentially on site visits, to determine the veracity of what people were saying or what they were claiming. And interestingly, in that first part of the program, 5 different military intelligence people from different, some of them were Navy personnel, some of them were U.S. Army personnel. All of them, the majority of them, had been exposed to combat in either Iraq or Afghanistan. So they were all sort of hardened and well accustomed to unusual circumstances and being out in the field, being out exposed to different things in the field. So all 5 of those people who were deployed during the OSAP program on the Skinwalker Ranch encountered bizarre activity. 100% of the people, in other words, it was not I would say my experience on the property was 98% of the time nothing happened. But in the case of all of these people who were deployed on Skinwalker Ranch, 100% of them had bizarre activity on the property. But even more than that, 100% of these people, when they went back to their homes on the East Coast, they brought something with them. And so, the classic example, the poster child for this phenomenon was the Axelrod family, who, when Axelrod himself encountered the activity on the property, he flew back to his home in Virginia, and within a month or two, it was almost like all hell broke loose in their house. And it was only really his wife and his teenage children who began to see these strange things that were happening in their environment. They'd wake up and these dark humanoid shadows would be leaning over their beds. They'd walk out to go to the bathroom, and they'd be they'd interact with these large, bizarre shaped black objects in their house. There would be orbs flying through the bedrooms, blue orbs, red orbs, white orbs. And the first alarming case was when Axelrod's wife it was about 11:30 at night, and she was just shutting down all the lights in the house, and she was just about to shut down the lights in the backyard when she looked out and she saw, standing next to a tree in the tree line of the property, what looked like a wolf-like creature. But the really weird thing was that it was actually standing on 2 legs, and it was leaning against the tree, and it was looking at her in a very unfriendly, baleful way. It was like it really shook her up. I mean, she had never seen anything like this in her life. I mean, she was a nurse. She was a woman with a lot of common sense who was not used to staring face to face at an upright wolf in her backyard. So she looked away, she looked back, and the creature was still there. And then the creature kind of walked away into the tree line on 2 legs. And again, anatomically impossible. I mean, if you put a German Shepherd on 2 legs, it can barely balance. I mean, it will teeter-totter maybe a step or two, but this creature walked back into the tree line, and this woman, she determined not to say anything to her husband or to her children about what she had seen. She put it down as something absolutely bizarre, but she would never repeat it to anybody. 3 days later, the 2 teenage boys were down in the living room, which opens onto the backyard. And one of them looks into the backyard and sees an upright wolf-like creature. And this was a Saturday morning at 10 o'clock, broad daylight. Looks at this upright creature that looked like a wolf, standing on 2 legs, staring in a very unfriendly way in at him as he was looking out. He alerted his brother, and both of them saw this thing. And suddenly it took off running on 2 legs, kicking up leaves as it went across the property, and it ran into the tree line and vanished. But, the 2 teenagers called to their family, and they all, accumulated in the living room. And it was at that stage when the mom admitted that she had seen a similar creature 3 nights previously. And the family then went out to the backyard to see if there was anything that they could see. And they walked over to the tree where the the mother had pointed out where this creature was standing. And on the tree, there was these distinct, what Axelrod described to me as really distinct claw marks on the tree. And remember, Axelrod has, top secret, special compartmented information clearances. I mean, he is a very high level Navy person, not given to fantasizing. But here he was telling me about this bizarre creature who had left really obvious claw marks on the tree in his backyard. So this was an example, one of the many examples of the so-called hitchhiker effect. But all 5 military intelligence personnel who were on the property as part of the DIA site visit, encountered bizarre activity on Skinwalker Ranch and also brought something home with them. So this was so prevalent. All of the security officers on the property also started reporting that paranormal stuff was erupting in their households. They also brought stuff home. George Knapp, who had been on the property a few times, who's co-author of our book, his wife started seeing things in her home. She saw blue orbs. She saw unusual activity in her home. So a lot of people had documented and validated this so-called hitchhiker effect. So we speculated in the book that, that the whole series of events as it unfolds, it's almost like some sort of an infectious entity. The primary person, Axelrod, on the property, who has this encounter, goes back to his family. His children and his wife start seeing things. It soon transpired that neighbors actually started seeing things in their neighborhood, and friends of the teenagers, and they didn't say anything. I mean, they were scared to say anything about this bizarre activity in their house. But these neighbors and school kids also started seeing things. So again, we speculate in the book that this is conforming to what looked like some kind of an infectious agent that was being transmitted from person to person. And so if in a future program, if this kind of thing was ever documented, if the N was bigger statistically, we could start applying all of the standard epidemiological modeling. I mean, there's been an enormous increase in the modeling as a result of the coronavirus outbreak 2 years ago. All of that kind of epidemiological modeling could be easily utilized for this kind of an effect to see if it actually did have infectious agent properties.
Well, Colm, I know we could continue our discussion for a long, long time. In the decades of paranormal research in which you've been engaged, there are many, many other case studies. So I'm very glad to let our viewers know that we plan to continue our conversations to cover more of the details of this very significant research that you've been intimately involved in for close to 25 years. So I want to, for the time being, thank you so much for being with me today, and I look forward very much to our next conversation.
Thank you, Jeff. It's been a real pleasure, and yes, I would love to continue this conversation. There's obviously a lot more to this story.
And for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us.